So last time we talked about egalitarianism. And can anybody tell me a little bit about egalitarianism? Anything at all about egalitarianism?
Well, I learned a lot, didn't we?
About a week ago, we spent about an hour and 10 minutes chit-chatting about it. But I think you walked away from that conversation. How many of you maybe were at least a little persuaded by the arguments for egalitarianism? Anybody thought, well, I didn't see it that way. Maybe there was maybe I was too hardcore on one end of the spectrum. Not a single, not a single
We're all
one.
frozen.
We've got the frozen chosen here tonight. There's not been, through church history, there's not been a solid consensus on the roles of men and women. And even when we were researching, okay, who can be a deacon at First Baptist Church? Are we going to isolate that to just men? Is this something that either men and women can be? And you will find, and to say I researched it is an understatement. I mean, I really did a deep dive on, well, who can be a deacon? And which churches take which positions and why. And so there was a lot that went into making that call. It was an elder decision. No one person made that decision. I remember what Billy Graham said. He said, I've been in ministry so long because I never made a decision by myself. I haven't forgotten what Billy Graham said. So we put our heads together and I think taking an honest look at the scriptures, positions in church history, positions along different denominational lines, among different Baptist churches, different academics, and different theologians, and it felt that, we think that we have a freedom for both men and women to be deacons at First Baptist Church. Now, did everybody agree with that? Well, none of us agree with everything, do we? I mean, no, not everybody agreed with that. Bigger deal for some people than for others, and that's okay.
So do we have women deacons?
We do. Yep, we do.
That's just this year, right?
That's just started in 2022. Yeah, we had installed about 15 folks, right? 5 ladies. A lot of the ladies were already doing, we considered deacon kind of work. I mean, it was, serving on committees, some from missions committees, some from our facilities committee, some from our hospitality kind of roles. And so, it was, they were already doing the work, just didn't have the title. So it's good, I think, to officially install people to do roles that Scripture calls for us to have, like deacons. But anyway, that was no small deal, And if we had not had an elder board, if we didn't have elders, a lot of times in churches, deacons function as the elders. That had to be taken into consideration. If we wouldn't have had elders, in the past, the church didn't have elders. They had a role of trustee and a role of deacon. I think there probably would have been a lot more trepidation to try and install women as deacons, because they were, in essence, filling a different kind of role. So anyway, all that to say, it was a big deal, that we all took it very seriously. So through church history, there's not been a total consensus on exactly what women can and cannot do. And I hope that we see as we go through this that certainly God values women, and there's dignity in the roles that women historically have had, and maybe even traditionally have had. And we'll dodge this subject because it's controversial. I don't think we should dodge subjects because they can be controversial. Certainly we don't let the culture dictate what is controversial or not controversial. So we need to talk about this because the Bible talks about this. And let's keep moving on. What is the complementarian view?
where are we in this?
We should be in session 10.
93.
93, okay, thank you, that's what I wanted.
See, there's a perfect, look at that compliment right there. It's like, one knew what the page was, one was asking, somebody knew, they could, what an example. So,
This is a very unique example.
it's usually the other way around, isn't it? That's the way it is in our family. So it's the position the Bible teaches that men and women are of equal worth, dignity, and responsibility before God. If you want to use the fancy seminary term, they're ontological. Same in being. Ontos is being. So the being of either is considered equal in God's eyes. God does not elevate or view as men or women, one being of higher value than the other, more dignity, but equal in worth. The Bible also teaches that men and women have different roles to play in society, the family and the church. These roles do not compete, but complement each other. So those who adhere to this, Grudem, Piper, Douglas Moo, Swindoll, and MacArthur. So these are some heavyweights in my opinion. A lot of these guys, I've got their books on my shelves and read their stuff. So why? Okay, why would we be complementarianism? Why would we not want to hold this view? And I think the scriptures lay out some pretty good reasons. So first of all, the Bible illustrates male leadership from the beginning of creation. So Adam, first of all, Adam named the animals. We talked about it last time, that the naming role, there is a bit of authority in that. And not only did Adam name the animals, but then he also named Eve. God didn't come back to name the animals. God didn't come back to name Eve. He left that responsibility with Adam. And then God approached Adam first after the fall. We talked about this a little last time. Why was that? I mean, why? Because Eve was the one who was tempted, right?
Right.
And then she ate, and then she gave it to Adam.
Responsible.
Okay, yeah, there was a degree of responsibility that God held Adam in, and he didn't fulfill that responsibility. You know, what have you done, Adam? There were no women priests in the Old Testament. If you go through the entirety of the Old Testament, never was a woman a priest. The God-ordained rulers of Israel were male. Jesus' apostles were all male. And then the bishops, presbyters, and pastors were all male. Look in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus. Now these are all functional roles. These are functions that are being laid out here that were held by men. And then second, Eve was created as a completer. In order for one to be incomplete, he or she must lack something. Adam lacked something that caused God to say, it is not good for man to be alone. Eve was created to complete that thing which was lacking. So don't ever miss that even though Adam had this face-to-face personal relationship with God, still the comment was, Adam, it is not good for you to be alone. It is not good. And Adam didn't argue back. He didn't say, but God, I mean, we hang out, you know, we walk in the garden, we do stuff. No, Adam, it's not good for you to be alone. It is important to realize that she was not simply a second attempt at perfection. Well, screwed up Adam. Let's try again. Let's see if we can get it right the second time. Eve was created with essential characteristics that Adam did not have. Likewise, Adam was created with characteristics that Eve did not have. They were created to complement each other. Therefore, the role distinction is essential for humanity to be complete. So this is the crux of the complementarian argument, is what we're reading right here. That they had qualities that the other didn't have. I mean, it's fascinating, even physically. After they sinned, they covered themselves. And what did they cover? They covered the parts that the other one didn't have. all of a sudden what God made as to complement the other became shameful to them. And they covered it up before God could see. So, and to this day, right? It's legally, you have to cover up. Legally, you have to cover up, unless there's laws made otherwise. And there's a few places you don't have to. Anyway, but why is that? Why do we still have laws that require people to, and what is it again? It's that which is different between men and women. So it wasn't that way in the beginning. They were, what's the Bible say? They were naked, they were unashamed. On this view, both man and woman need to function together for God to be accurately represented to mankind. In other words, both roles represent God to mankind. And then egalitarianism then would distort God's image. If they're trying to make the argument that in terms of roles there's no difference functionally between men and women, then God would be, his attributes would be less displayed, if that makes sense. If man and woman are just the same, there's no distinction in role or function. So then, and then it's not to say also, the needs of singleness can be met. It's not to say that if someone is single, that for any reason they're
incomplete.
Yeah, that they're incomplete. Thank you. Because it's still men and women in society that are representing God, not just within the marriage union.
Well, like Paul and what he said, if you can handle it, you can be like, should be like me.
Right. If you can handle it, right? Most people can't handle it. So, right, you get married. In Ephesians, interestingly in Ephesians 5:21 though, you see this mutual submission. And you don't see, you see Paul there saying, wives submit to husbands, but he also says husbands submit to wives. There's not like a distinct one submitting to the other in that passage. It's not like that everywhere. But in that passage it's different. So he's not emphasizing in that sense, he's not emphasizing the roles of one being submissive to the other. In that passage he's emphasizing something else. He's emphasizing a mutuality. So I have written down there, in the egalitarian view, women as same in the sense they function the same ways, they mutually submit. But he's also elevating the point that men, if they were to say, because if you look at Genesis 3, we'll look at it again, if you look at Genesis 3, he said that the man's going to try and dominate the woman. She'll want control, he'll try and dominate. And that's wrong too. Both of those are an effect of the fall. So in Ephesians 5:2-1, Paul's establishing the ideal that he appreciates those things about her which he does not hold himself. So, if men would think they're logical, or, and if men would get stuck in the trap of thinking because I am more logical, that she should be more like me. And likewise, if one would think, look, I'm more emotional and he needs to be more like me, or however that is, that's where the abrasiveness starts. That's where the abrasion can be. And God is saying, no, each of you should appreciate about the other that which is unique to them. We're not trying to make everyone alike here. So it's both men and women functioning in the world that brings us fuller picture of God. And then number 3, Paul constantly had to address women who were failing to understand the importance of their role as women, or who were in outright rebellion against it. And these women were blurring the God-ordained roles and attempting to usurp the role of man. And this rebellion is part of the curse. So I just mentioned this a minute ago. Now let's walk through some of these passages where that appears to be the case. And we'll start out in Genesis. To the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you will bring forth children. Yet you will want to control your husband, and he will rule over you. So he's saying you're going to want to usurp the authority. You're going to want to usurp the power. It's just what you're going to want to do. And God told, in that same word there, that want, in just a few verses over, God's going to tell Cain, you want sin. It's going to control you. You're going to have to learn how to master it. And the women are going to want to control the men, not just in marriage, but just in society in general, is what point God is making. Moses is the one writing. Any questions about that one? We're going to keep going. There's a lot more verses. We'll keep going through these.
Why does it say usually, but like in my Bible, I don't have it here, but it doesn't say you want to control, desire, right?
Yeah, if you were to
that
just,
word desires in there?
if you were to just read it, I've never understood it this way, just
Yeah,
from reading.
right,
You know.
never.
Okay. Sometimes you do a dive on these words and see how it's used elsewhere, and it gives you a sense of how it's used.
Oh, that's right. Yeah,
Generally.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the first time I've seen it, yeah.
Okay.
I thought it meant you'd still want your husband, but you're gonna have pain from the results of it. That's what I always thought it meant.
Yeah. I don't think that's the case. I think
Yeah.
it's a.
This control.
I had a
thing.
pastor, the pastor at my church in Dallas. He wrote a book called The Lord of the Rings. Now you've probably heard of Tolkien's book, The Lord
Yeah,
of the
right.
Rings. He used the same title, but a completely different idea. It was about wedding rings. Yeah, who's going to be the Lord of the Rings? And it was about the power struggle, that goes on. And nowhere is it a man's response. The problem here is this idea of he's going to rule over you. It's in a negative sense. Like he's going to try and dominate you. And nowhere in the Bible, when it talks about submission, does it ever say anything about one person trying to force another to submit. It is totally the will and the decision of the individual to do that. So it's not my responsibility if my wife submits. It's not. It's up to her. It's her decision. Yes, sir.
Got a little tidbit for the group and you.
Here we go.
For Tolkien.
Yes.
Famous author of Lord of the Rings,
Right.
that movie.
Right?
In Europe, the New Jerusalem Bible is very popular. It's a thought for thought, kind of like the NIV Bible, right? He was one of the authors.
Really?
Yeah.
The Jerusalem Bible.
He was used by the folks that put that Bible together as for his writing ability. And
Interesting.
yeah, he's listed as one of the contributors in the front cover of that, but I have a copy of it at home.
Oh wow! I did not know that. I know he knew some ridiculous number of languages. It was like
it was incredible.
it was in the teens.
Really?
Yeah, I think C.S. Lewis knew like 8 or 9 languages, and Tolkien knew like
Twice that.
yeah. It was like, and it's a lot of Old English stuff. Yes, sir.
Fun fact, J.R. and C.S. Lewis were actually pretty good friends.
They had a writing group called the Inklings, right? There was those two and another guy.
Yeah, they were both Catholic. Yeah.
All
Yeah,
right.
pretty interesting.
Interesting, huh?
Good stuff. Okay. Moving along. 1 Timothy 2:12 through 15. And this is a tough one. We're going to talk about this one for a minute. We've got a lot of notes on this I want to share. 1 Timothy 2:12 through 15. But I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. For it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve. And it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. But women will be preserved through the bearing of children if they continue in faith and love and sanctity with self-restraint. Okay. There's lots we could talk about here. It's a tough passage. And Timothy was in Ephesus. And in writing to Ephesus, I'm going to explain something to you that I had to go to seminary to learn this. I'm going to try my best to explain the cultural basis that a lot of scholars think is going on here. This is a one view. I think it holds a lot of weight. whenever Paul started writing to churches in this Greco-Roman world, women, and in Judaism, women were not even allowed to go to school. They weren't allowed to learn. If you look at a lot of Islamic countries now, how women are treated, it was very much that way in that Middle Eastern world, around the Mediterranean. So all of a sudden, Christ comes on the scene, Paul comes on the scene, and Paul's saying things like, there's no longer slave and free, there's no longer Jew and Gentile, there's no longer what? There's neither male nor female. And women were liberated in ways that they had never been liberated before, such that Paul, not only were women to start learning, but Paul had women, following him around, learning at his feet. Jesus had women following him around, learning, and it was like, whoa, wait a second. We aren't just objects and pieces of property like we used to be. And this was revolutionary in that world. No one had ever treated women with that kind of respect and dignity that Paul and Jesus and the apostles had been doing. Now, in doing that, you had this very male-dominated, male-centric world. And it was like the pendulum swung over here to being a much more liberated world for women than it ever had been in the past. And they're starting to learn, so they're speaking up more. So Paul was very revolutionary in that sense. So women, because though they had not had the freedom and had, it just wasn't open for them to receive the same kind of educations that men had been receiving. And they portray this very well. If any of you have been watching The Chosen, they portray the women as not getting the same teachings that the men had been getting, so they're all kind of playing catch up where all the men knew what had gone on in Hebrew and Hebrew school. So they portray that in that series as well. But now this is different. So the women at this time would not have had nearly the amount of education that the men would have had, because the men from a small age were enrolled in schools.
That's true of the Orthodox community right now. All of those things are still very true.
The Greek and Eastern Orthodox?
Very, very ultra-Orthodox, especially in Israel, especially in Jerusalem.
I mean, the Hasidic Jews and the
right, the Hasidic.
Can't enroll in the schools.
Right.
So then, all of a sudden, the women aren't pushed down like they were before. So they start speaking up more, and Paul's like, oh, okay, now, hold on a second. Can we just back up a second? And Paul is trying to then correct the culture. So he's trying now to, because the pendulum went here, it's like now he's kind of trying to bring it down to the right place. And the Bible was written in a male-dominated world. So he's coming against the culture, and as it's been. And sometimes you move the needle, when you want the needle to land here, you move something here to get you want to bring it back there. It seems like there's something like that going on. Now this is one view that I think holds a lot of weight to why he's using the language he's using and speaking the way that he's speaking. Because, the idea of women remaining quiet, women were starting to play more and more significant roles. And there were prophetesses in some place where Paul was teaching them how to prophesy better than what they had been. So he's making this corrective, and had there been a different kind of issue in the culture, he would have been offering a corrective to that. So if the Bible written into the culture we have now, it could be, for example, we are way more individualistic now than the church used to be. The idea of a personal relationship with God is very unique to the church in our century. Has actually been a problem than it was in centuries past. We have this individualistic perspective. We have a lower view of the community approach, the corporate approach to God, than we do the individual approach to God. If I ask most people, what do you think is more important, your personal quiet devotion times or being at church? I think a lot of people say, well, it's my personal devotion time. Well, that's even a new thing. In the history of the church, personal devotion time, most people couldn't read for the bulk of church history. So the corporate approach to God was always valued. This was almost unheard of. So Paul wants to move to this middle position in a male-dominated world. And, over here was non-complementarian when it was male-dominated. But then over here, when if it's going to be both roles doing the exact same thing, it's also non-complementarian. So he's trying to get to this middle complementarian position. Does that make sense? Any questions about that?
But why does he make that statement in the last statement?
Okay.
The but.
So we're getting to that one. We're getting to that one. And I want to address the so that can't speak part. He'll say something similar to this in another verse we'll look at, but I don't believe. I take that in the sense that at this stage he doesn't think they should be teaching. They haven't had that education. But we'll see later, it's not just a cultural thing, because look at the argument he uses. He goes back to creation to make the point that he's making here. So he uses creation and not the culture to make this argument, and that women were misunderstanding their functional role. Again, they're ontologically equal. Their being is equal in God's eyes. But he's saying you have a different role, that functionally men and women are different in the church. But he also wants to be clear. In case you think you don't have dignity, or in case you think you're less than, then he gets to the but. They have a specific role that has as much dignity as any other role. Now he uses this example of childbearing. And at that time, childbearing was a huge deal for women. Not as much now. But then you had dignity, and that's why if you read through the Old Testament, just how tore up women were, when they were unable to bear children, with an incomplete revelation on heaven. Men thought the only way their line could continue, their house would go on, their family would go on, was through their sons. So it was just so important for them to have kids. So if a woman couldn't provide that, it was a huge deal. It's not the same now. In our culture, that I would say most people say it's probably neutral in regard to dignity for childbearing. So it doesn't mean that you can only have dignity if you have kids, but it's in the uniqueness of being a woman. It has more to do with the idea of your ability, your uniqueness in what you have. There is dignity in that function that is unique to men, or unique to women, different from men. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. This is a concept that you've got to wrap your. I had to noodle on this quite a bit myself. So women, you have all these gifts that you gain through your dignity through childbearing is one, but that's not all of them. So we don't see it, it's different in our culture, so we don't see it quite the same way as they would have. So, any questions there? Is it muddy? Vicki, you just like you got a question right on the tip of your tongue.
No, I'm okay.
Are you sure? It could be fun to kick it around a little bit.
No, it's okay.
So then what about teaching or authority? And so the idea of teaching, and I do take this to be a sort of spiritual headship position. I take this to be an ongoing teaching role in the church, is what I believe Paul has in view here. And different churches take different views on this, for sure. But it seems like, some churches, for example, will take the view, well, only when a man is not present, a woman can teach, like a mixed audience, if a man's not there. If you look at Iran and China, they've got churches forming all the time, and it's mainly women running the show in those churches, especially the underground churches in China. And then some churches will take the view that a woman can never teach a man, regardless of the situation. Forget it, no way. We just won't have teachers. Some will take that position. And some take this in a progressive sense, continually teaching. I was saying before, like a weekly pastor. And exegetically, it's kind of difficult to tell exactly which one is right. Because unless you're going to try to make the argument that, if you were to take this to the nth degree, you'd almost have to say that you shouldn't even read a book written by a woman. And I don't think that's what Paul had in mind. Or you could carry it over and say, well, in any situation, church or secular, a woman shouldn't be able to teach a man. And I don't think that's what Paul has in mind here. I think these are instructions that are being given to the church. So, personally, women, I don't believe they're to exercise headship. I don't believe, for example, that the role of pastor, elder, and I don't see a distinction between pastors and elders in the New Testament. But when you start talking about classes and, it's a onesie-twosie kind of thing. Even we bring women in to talk, at First Baptist we'll bring women to talk about, we had a trauma class for kids. Parents who are parenting kids who have experienced trauma. And the local expert was a woman on that. She came in and taught. Again, that's not a spiritual headship kind of a role, but she was the expert, and we wanted her to come in and teach on that.
It wasn't scriptural. What she was teaching had nothing to do with the Bible, right?
Yeah. So, again, I think you have to think through if there's no men present. It seems like in the Bible that women will step up into roles they normally wouldn't if there's no men present. If you look at Deborah back in the Old Testament, she stepped in as a judge. But again, if you go through the whole passage, we went through this last time, it's like she tried to tell the dude, Barak, look, go and do your job. He's like, I'm not going to, not unless you come with me. She's like, okay, if that's the way it's got, if you need me to hold your hand, I'll hold your hand. So, it seems, but there's also times when we prefer to have women doing certain things. We've never asked a man to come and watch our son. We've never asked a guy to do that. And yes.
I definitely prefer my mother doing the cooking. So
Okay. And I know some guys are great
And I
cooks.
prefer that your dad does the cooking.
Your mom prefers dad does the cooking?
Well, if those brownies are any indication,
exactly.
Just
That's
yeah.
my case.
Since we're a little off track, so Beth Moore,
Yes.
when you think of her doing all what she does, that's looked down upon by.
So it's like, it's not a question of gifting. She is a tremendously gifted teacher. The question is audience. To what audience should she be speaking?
Yeah.
I think that's the question. And it's not that I haven't, and she's not exercising, and the other question would be, it's not like she's exercising headship in a church. She's doing a parachurch ministry.
Okay.
So that should be taken into consideration too. And I'm still working some of this out. I went to a seminary that is complementarian. Dallas Theological Seminary is not egalitarian. They think there's a distinction between the roles of men and women. They still had women come and speak in chapel to a mixed audience. And these are the guys writing the books on, they know more about the Bible than I'll ever know. And so, when I say that people fall in different places, I'm not like a 10. We talked about, are you a 1 or a 10 on some of these beliefs and doctrines? I'm not a 10 on a lot of this stuff. I'm like a 5. I believe there is distinct roles for men and women. I believe there's some for men. I believe there's some for women. But when you get outside that pastor-elder role, then you've got to start doing some figuring. Because again, unless you're going to take the position that as a man you shouldn't read a book written by a woman, that seems, I can't buy that. So,
In a way, it just doesn't seem, it seems just cultural but yet I don't understand that because it's obviously inspired by God. Because like, that's 1 Corinthians 11:13 or 11:3. I just backed up and was reading. Says, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her. You know, I mean,
Right.
we do that all the time now.
That part is definitely cultural, about what hair meant to, at that time, and braiding your hair, right? Hats are no longer a sign of submission. They're no longer a sign. So it has a completely different meaning now. Yeah, if you think sometimes, well, if the Bible were written today, if Paul was writing First Sheridan 1:1, you know, Sheridanites 1:1, what would he be addressing here at our church? Have you ever thought about that? Like, what would be, because every time he writes a letter to a church, he's addressing issues in the church. They're split. They've got different, they're putting weight on some gifts more than others. What would he write to? Maybe I don't want to know what he'd write to. First Baptist Church Sheridan. There are cultural things going on here. You know, he's certainly, I think, he's distinguishing between roles of men and women. Certainly, I think that's happening. You know, but we have so many roles and now that they didn't have then. Good. See? It's good stuff. Good discussion. So again, you know, in Iran and China, there's teachers. I had a fantastic Hebrew teacher in seminary. It was a woman. So Eve is deceived in the sense here that Adam didn't fill his role. He was too weak to take the stand that he should have taken. And then men, you know, again, it's when men elevate attributes that they value in themselves over women or vice versa, that's when you have a problem and it gets abrasive. So there's more verses we're going to be looking at. Let's move on through and hopefully it'll help spur discussion and we can talk some more about this. 1 Corinthians 14:34 and 35. The women are to keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but are to subject themselves, just as the law also says. If they desire to learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is improper for a woman to speak in church. Okay, now what are we going to do with this one? Because I've been encouraging ladies to speak, right? I want to hear what you have to say. Am I sinning? Am I violating what it is he's saying here? Are we in church right now? There's two or more gathered. So here's what I believe is going on. And it kind of goes back to that discussion about women had not been allowed to go to get any schooling. I mean, women being schooled is a new thing, practically, as Paul's writing these letters.
In the Hebrew church, the Jewish church, the women were separated.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the temple, right? If you look at the temple, there was called the court of the women. The women were not allowed to hear the rabbi like the men were allowed to. They were in two different places, two separate spots. So, you know, I think what's going on here at this stage, women have not been as educated as the men had, just by nature of the beast. By nature of how women had been treated in that society. So the husband would have had more education than the men. So in that context, in the context of, well, the husband started attending school when he was a little guy, and the women weren't allowed to do that, Paul was asserting, look, it's like this. It's like next semester we're going to be teaching soteriology, okay? Now the way you're supposed to do these classes, you've got to take them in succession. So if somebody, for example, wanted to take the soteriology class, and I said, well, you've got to have the humanity and sin class before you can take the soteriology class, because they build on each other. But I said, well, I'll tell you what, since you didn't take this class, but you'll be in the next one, why don't you kind of like audit it, sit through it, but don't ask questions, because we already covered those questions in the last one. It's kind of like that. Because you didn't get the background, and everybody else did,
You'd be disruptive to the.
You'd be disruptive. Yes, sir.
So you had touched base on it earlier with that Jewish culture and that Hasidic, well, what we call now. If you spend any time around those folks, you're right, it's very male dominated. But it's not just, a 20-year-old male doesn't just go up and start confronting a rabbi. So there's an age and social hierarchy to that society. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So if there was a meeting or a prayer get together, or it's go watch The Sopranos. A made guy gets to talk more than a non-made guy, right? So it's the kind of I know I'm kind of going off the thing. I've got the mob involved here, but
There's an order.
there is an order.
It's like the military.
So I would venture to say at this time that women weren't the only ones being told they had to be quiet. I think the younger, less established, seasoned males were probably having to be a little quieter than their counterparts that were older.
Yeah. Yeah, there's going to be similar
Well, that's how
instructions
it is
given to
now.
children.
I mean, that's how it is now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I had the privilege of spending some time around some Hasidic Jews in their culture.
Oh,
And I remember Rabbi Weg. Yeah, you just didn't go talk serious issues with Rabbi Weg if you were like under 40 years old.
oh wow.
So there's a pecking order.
A pecking order, a hierarchy. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean, it also just wasn't just women around that time, you know, there's kind of major discrimination, because for the Jews, you know, it was us or them, you know, Jews and Gentiles, and basically, you know, Gentiles, I mean, like the Samaritans, you know, they had some people sent over for that, but basically they were very looked down on. If I remember correctly, they were definitely not allowed anywhere near the temples.
Yeah, there was a court for women in a particular place at the temple they had to stand in. They couldn't go to the court where all the men were, kind of closer to the altar. And then even if you read some of the rabbinic stuff, things that they would write about, like they would thank God that they were not born a woman. Like rabbis would make statements like this. It was bad. It was really bad. Yeah. It wasn't good. And again, Paul is correcting the culture, but he brought it over here from where it was over here, and he's wanting to find the right spot. He's wanting them to land in the right place. Okay. 1 Corinthians 11:3, but I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ. And yeah, I mean, one of the problems in 1 Corinthians is they were putting weight and emphasis on things they should. They did the same thing with spiritual gifts. Just a couple of chapters later, Paul's going to say, look, you're not to be valuing one gift over another. And so he's setting things in order. And he's not saying one's superior. He's wanting to set a sense of roles. And he's instructing the women, you're not seeing the right roles yet. You can't see them yet. This wasn't right. This wasn't right. Again, we got to come back to where's the right roles for women in this. And this is in the context of the head covering passage here in 1 Corinthians 11. And there was he's not saying you're wrong in submitting to your husband. If you're taking off the head covering because you think that's what you're doing, then hold off on that. We don't have the equivalent in our culture today. I don't know exactly what the equivalent in our culture today would be. But it was a sign of something else going on. That was the issue. It was a hard issue behind the head covering. But we don't use head coverings that way. Colossians 3:18, wives, submit to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord. Again, this is this is a function within the family that Paul's saying there are roles to fulfill. Titus 2:5, women are to be sensible pure, workers at home, kind, being subject to their own husbands, so that the word of God will not be dishonored. Again, the whole point here is giving dignity to women, not taking it away. He's saying there is dignity in the work that you are doing right now. Don't think that this man's work has more dignity or value than the dignity that you have in the roles that you're doing in this culture at this time, And women take different roles now. And it's not to say that's wrong either, It's whatever role you're in. There's not less dignity in these roles of rearing children than there is in being a doctor, being a lawyer, whatever it may be. Four, the New Testament writers constantly had to address men who abuse their role as leaders. This is part of the curse. The instruction to men, however, is not to stop leading, but to lead in a way that is sensitive, encouraging, and loving. And this has also been a problem through history, is men abusing their role. And they want to keep dominating. That's also part of the fall. So again, back to Genesis. Multiply pain in childbirth, and pain you will bring forth children, yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. So that's the problem. This men ruling. This is also a result of the fall. Ephesians 5:25, and these other verses from Ephesians 5. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. So husbands also ought also to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. Nevertheless, each individual among you also is to love his own wife even as himself. Now this was unheard of at this time. Like there's a reason Paul is writing this. It's because this is not how people thought at all. I mean, the men would have been like, what are you talking about here? Because the man could treat the woman however in the world he wanted to. Abusive. And Paul's saying, no. You've got this all wrong. How you're acting is a result of the fall. And he's saying you have to love her like it's your own body, how you treat her. 1 Peter 3:7, you husbands in the same way live with your wives in an understanding way, as with someone weaker, since she is a woman, and show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered. So the weaker part here, it could be one of two things. He could just be talking about a physically weaker person, or it could be he just talking about like a more gentle natured person. So, but don't miss the command that the husbands, they're not to abuse the role they have in their family. And they want to fulfill their role by loving their wives. And I know in our family, so we have a little boy named Landry that my wife and I love dearly. He's a handful. And sometimes I don't know what to do. Oftentimes I don't know what to do. And I'm just kind of and my wife sees me, this is the universal signal for, you got to help me here because I don't have a clue what I'm doing. Now, I would be nuts not to listen to her and take her advice. I have created more problems when I don't do this. Some of the biggest mistakes I've made in my life is when I wouldn't listen to my wife. Did I tell you the story about what happened at the water park? So we went to the Schlitterbahn down in Texas. We're at the world's biggest water park. It's a blast. If you're ever down in San Antonio, you need to go to Schlitterbahn. So we go to this thing, and you had to pay an extra $1 to get a, what was it, a locker? Yeah, you had to pay an extra $1 to get a locker. Well, we don't need to get down. Chad, we're going to be on these water rides. And no, I can put that key, the car key right in my back pocket here.
Oh, dear.
Oh, no.
So we go on this ride called the Dragon Blaster. I'll never forget the name. The Dragon Blaster. we get to the bottom of it, and I reach back, and my pocket is completely inside out. The key is gone. I will tell you this though, and it even to tell the story now gets me all misty. She did not complain one bit about me not listening to her. Even we were standing out there in that hot parking lot, waiting for the key guy to get there to cut us a new key for the car, after her husband didn't listen to her, and the key is at the bottom of some water ride called the Dragon Blaster. You know, she said, I'll never forget this. Oh, it's humbling. She said, Chad, I just don't want this to ruin your day. I will never, ever forget that.
How many keys do you suppose they find at the bottom of the water?
I found out that weekly they have a scuba diver come and gather up all the keys, and they actually mailed it back to us. They said, yeah, this happens all the time, but
Cool.
you know, the scuba diver, they said, go back to the base of the ride. It may have washed down and you can find it there, but yeah, we didn't, we had to pay $100 for the key guy to come. So instead of the $1 locker, we paid for the new $100 car key. Our insurance did cover like $85, so it was like a $15, still a lot more than the $1 locker. Husbands, listen to your wives.
But that's really true about the scuba diver coming?
That's true, yeah, he had a job, he'd just come and he'd like search all the rides, the pools, gather up stuff, and
Boy,
give
what
them
he
the lost and
gathered
found.
must have been something else.
Yeah, scars.
Is this indoor or outdoor?
This is outdoor, yeah.
Right.
It's
Dang, I
amazing.
thought that'd
Check
be
it
a
out.
winter
Thanks, we're
vacation.
going now.
Yeah, talk to your parents. Talk your parents into it. There's a lot to do down there.
I don't think I need to do any talking.
It's actually in New Braunfels, which is just right outside San Antonio. Okay, but then look at, so, you know, in essence, failure to treat women with dignity and respect, look at the consequence of that. It's going to sever your relationship with God if you don't do this. So, your prayers, you know, to such a degree, your prayers are going to fall on deaf ears. So, he's saying God is not going to tolerate men abusing women and abusing their leadership responsibility. So that, like, husbands have to repent too. You know, the relationship's got to be restored. If husbands are abusing this position, it's hindering their prayers, it's severing the relationship. So it's a big deal to God. And so, if I ever, there's been times I thought, okay, well, I'm the rational one in this relationship, therefore I should be saying such and such. Man, oh man. Yeah, it was the rational side of me that said, hey, we don't need to pay that extra $1 for the locker.
It was the cheap side.
It was the cheap side. Yeah. Yeah. I feel you, man. I feel you. Yeah. So, be sensitive to the other person's specialness. Like if there was one proposition we should walk away from tonight, is be sensitive to the other person's specialness. The spouse's specialness. Colossians 3:19, husbands, love your wives and do not be embittered against them. Don't be harsh. Don't harshly rule. And again, I've failed there before, and pastors can be horrible. I get paid to communicate for a living, and, I can, you can come up with things quick, and you can be really horrible with words at times. And you can't do that. 5, and this isn't a great argument, but most of church history has adhered to a complementarian view. So just others have believed this before us. So any comments or questions about those? Anything stuck in your craw, as they say?
Well, I just don't understand where they came up with that word desire for what you call control. Where's that? I've never, like Donna's saying, I've never ever heard this before, ever.
Let me,
But
I'm going to,
I just think that's kind of, not that I don't believe you, but I'm just saying.
Well,
I want to bring
sounds
up,
like it.
No. I just don't get the connection between control and desire. You desire control?
so this is the Net Bible. Genesis 3:16, to the woman he said, I will greatly increase your labor pains. With pain you will give birth to your children. You will want to control your husband. And they got really good notes. Or, and toward the Hebrew, literally, and toward your husband will be your desire. The nominal sense does not have a verb. A future verb is supplied. The precise meaning of the noun is debated. Many interpreters conclude that it refers to sexual desire here because the subject of the passage is the relationship between a wife and her husband, because the word is in a romantic sense in Psalms. That's another argument. It's used in Song of Solomon. We all know what that book's about.
Same word?
Yes, in a romantic sense. However, this interpretation makes little sense of Genesis 3:16. It does not fit well with the assertion, he will dominate you. Second, it implies that sexual desire was not part of the original creation. In other words, it wasn't because of the fall that there was sexual desire there. Even though the man and the woman were told to multiply. And then third, it ignores the usage of the word in Genesis 4:7. I think this is really the key to understanding in this way, where it refers to sin's desire to control and dominate Cain. So, same word, and
That's
God's
where-
instruction to Cain is, and you are going to have to master it, or it's going to master you.
Okay.
So the Lord announces a struggle, a conflict between the man and the woman. She will desire to control him, but he will dominate her instead. So that would be that's the interpretive sense there. By the way, this is why I like the New English translations, because it walks you through these kinds of. You can get the hard copy of this Bible. I like this is an electronic copy of the Net New English translation. It's just got great notes in it. It really explains why they made the decision they made.
Okay.
I can email that note to you all if you want it. That note it has on that.
Email it to me.
That's right, I can email it. I can print it out for you. How about that? Okay. Good question. All right, then response to complementarianism. I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly. The illustration, so this is how the egalitarians would respond to what these complementarian arguments and defenses are. So first of all, the first argument we made was in the Bible, all the leadership positions are male. They would say, well, these illustrations of male leadership were descriptive, not prescriptive. In other words, male leadership, like slavery, was a cultural phenomenon that God chose not to overthrow at the time. So they would just argue that's just the world that they were living in. Though we did look and see how Paul made the argument that was based on the order of creation as opposed to just it being descriptive. Then number two, while it is agreed that the woman was created to complete humanity, not man, this does not. So this was the argument that Eve was made to complete Adam. It is agreed that the woman was created to complete humanity, not man. This does not necessitate that God intended a functional hierarchy. Male leadership, rulership, domination, wherever name it goes by, was a product of the fall, not creation. Yeah, the argument against that would be the naming of the animals, right? That all happened. The naming and the authority happened before the fall. 3, Paul was writing to cultural situations that do not demand a universal application. For example, when Paul wrote to Timothy in Ephesus, there were women who were former cult prostitutes and uneducated, typically only receiving secondhand instruction from their husbands. They were attempting to fill the pulpit. He uses Eve to illustrate how destructive secondhand information can be. He does not use the events in the garden as a universal principle. Paul's command here is then purely cultural. It's just cultural. And that whole argument about going back on the creation, well, he was just using that to illustrate his cultural argument. So, Eve didn't get her instructions from God. I'm sorry, I'll switch that. They're saying that, well, Eve didn't get her instructions from God, but from Adam, so it was secondhand, and that's how destructive secondhand information can be. But Paul goes back to the garden, so I got that a little twisted, sorry. So he's saying, the argument is, well, this is secondhand information that women only got from their husband.
The secondhand information was from Satan.
Well, there you go. Yeah. Yeah. Number 4, these passages in the New Testament do not regulate how husbands are to rule, but do instruct on how they are to relate. They are to love their wives and not rule over them. It doesn't seem like that's, I mean, again, the idea of ruling or dominating is not what's really in view. Leading, I think, is more what was in view from what Paul was saying. 5, it is a sad fact that the history of the church is littered with abusive relationships coming from man's sinful tendency to dominate. Christians abused the Jews, they justified slavery, and they forced people to convert during the Inquisitions. Any appeal to history carries little weight in these areas and might even work against the complementarian view. Well, okay. So maybe that's not a great argument to say that, well, history showed that the church held the complementarian view. Their argument is, well, that the church has done a lot of things. Okay, maybe that's not a great argument. Of 250 cultures should be studied, males dominate in almost all. Males are almost always the rule makers, hunters, builders, fashioners of weapons, workers in metal, wood, or stone. Women are mostly caregivers and mostly involved in child rearing. The fact that these universals transcend divergent animal groups and cultures suggests that there must be predeterminants of gender-related behaviors. This was from the book called Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. So this is Greg Johnson just making an argument that historically it seems like there's, in every culture, there's been these different roles, these complementarian roles. So there are just some basic biological differences between men and women. Again, it seems that they were made to have different roles and functions. Women store more fat and retain more heat. Why do you think that would be?
For childbirth.
Childbirth, yeah, for childbirth and child rearing. Secondly, they have more white blood cells and B and T lymphocytes and can fight off infection faster. How might that be advantageous?
Take care of the children.
Right, again, children, yeah.
See bullet point 1.
See bullet point 1. Are more perceptive due to a more responsive sensory system, finer body hair, more acute sense of hearing, taste, touch, and smell. Can discriminate color better, particularly on the red end of the spectrum. Now, it could be that would make them more able to see some kind of a rash, according to one optometrist, they can actually see up to 20 times better the reds than men can. They have less testosterone, which makes them more patient, stay in the immediate family longer. A baby's cry triggers involuntary responses. We'll just leave that there. I don't know everything. And then produce more cortisol during prolonged stressful situations. Cortisol reduces serotonin, which can lead to depression. So,
I don't agree with number 3.
what's number 3? More perceptive with the sensory system?
I don't buy all of that with the hearing, taste, touch, and smell, but I think they are more perceptive to emotional, social cues.
Okay. This is from the biological basis for gender-specific behavior. So
The greatest, then we have to discuss the success of man in
Now we're
music
going to the men.
and conducting, chefs, painters, artists, all the things that require touch, taste, and smell. That's something to think about.
yeah. Yeah, these are definitely not, I think you'd have to look at the historical, the artist thing is interesting. I never thought about the artist part.
Or have you ever watched those shows where they blindfold those people and they put different tastes on what it is? Like, the average person in this room can't hold a candle to like a professionally trained chef in France, or, you know, Gordon Ramsay or something that's gonna be able to tell you, well, that's a this, or that, right?
Yes, this coffee I'm drinking was,
Yeah.
the beans were picked for a
That's
Colombia that
Julio's
had eggs for
farm,
breakfast.
That's
Yeah,
Julio's farm in Colombia, yeah.
right. Yeah, interesting. Carson.
Yeah. Once, I think, yeah, it was a year ago during Thanksgiving. I mean, I kind of had COVID, so my taste was a little wonky, but basically I thought I was having really soggy turkey that on Thanksgiving night, but it turns out I was eating a pot roast my dad had made.
Joke's on you, Carson.
Yep, it tastes good either way, so I didn't really care.
They were pulling a fast one on you. Here, have some turkey,
We were
Carson.
sick, Marlon had to cook.
So you had pot roast. Pot roast for Thanksgiving.
Yep. It was supposed to be a great
Really?
Randall trip, turned into a sad little suburb by myself while I watched the Pet Olympics.
But you're not bitter or anything.
Yeah, no, I'm perfectly fine with it.
So men, 10% higher metabolic rate, 50% more muscle mass. Although I tell you what, I do these Anytime Fitness classes, and they're mixed classes. There's some women. This doesn't hold true for me, I tell you that. There's women there pumping some iron, they put me to shame. Have more sweat glands to dissipate heat faster. What might that be? Why might that be helpful?
For working harder.
Working harder or hunting maybe?
Taking the trash out.
Taking the trash out. But yeah.
Here, here.
And I think as years go, men will have desensitized smell, right? That'll have 10% more red blood cells, so wounds heal faster. 15 times higher testosterone after puberty, more aggressive, more sexually active, enjoy competitive sports, leave their family earlier, and are prone to argue. I understand that even if they do a study on like violent prisoners, that they have higher levels of testosterone than most men do. Produce more testosterone during prolonged stressful times, giving more endurance, but are more apt to have hypertension. So, just more strokes and heart attacks, but more endurance. So, interesting. Do you think that culture looks down on the roles of women?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, you're talking about our culture right now?
Right now.
Depends on where you go.
Down on the roles of women?
Yeah.
I think it's getting pushed so much out of shape, it's unreal.
It's like traditional roles of women. Like,
Oh,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
see what you
I
mean.
think if they see a woman who stays home with the kids, they think they're, not doing enough.
Right.
When actually it's harder, in my opinion.
Absolutely it is.
It's harder.
well, it's like, and there we don't even, like, it's harder. And if you were to look at what's more important, I mean, sometimes I think I've got the less important role. My wife is the one home raising a son. And not in any way to denigrate, I think I've got a very important job, don't get me wrong. But still, I mean, the importance of bringing up another human being, preparing them for the world, preparing them for life,
And not messing them up.
not messing them up.
Well, then look at if the role is swapped, like a stay-at-home dad, they really look down on stay-at-home dad. So
Yeah.
is it the
Yeah.
role, or is it, what they're doing, the tasks that is looked down on? Because, I mean, yeah, men
Yeah.
are lazy layabouts if they're doing something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, we've got at least one stay-at-home dad here.
I have a good friend whose wife is a physician in town, and he's been a stay-at-home dad. They have 3 kids, ever since. And I'm just telling you, that's a lot.
Yeah.
I'm just telling you, that's a lot.
How old are the kids?
Oh, they're young. Yeah, they're young. They're all under 6th grade.
Okay.
So it's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, I know in our family who's got the harder job. Like,
Did he give birth?
Did you what?
Did he give birth to them?
No, but what he's
because
doing
now
right now
soc-
is a lot, that's all I'm
Well,
saying.
because now society's almost trying to tell us that.
Oh, men can have children.
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh,
yes.
yeah. No, God, it's not that. He didn't do that.
He wasn't one of those.
No. He's just the right of a tell on how.
Like there's no
But
difference
he,
between the genders.
Yeah. No.
Yeah. Now, what they've got new titles now, right? You
Birth
can't-
person.
Birth person.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. Oh, man. So this, and well, so this is just to show these different traits, male and female. Again, this is a complementarian anthropology, a complementarian view of men and women. So there's ontological equality, again, equal in the eyes of God, but when you look at the primary traits of men, more independent, logical, ambitious, and this is just generally speaking. There's lots of exceptions. Versus women, primary traits, relational, emotionally sensitive, and compassionate. And I was thinking, is anybody else this way? If you ever call and you want, like if you call an airline, would you rather talk to a man or a woman?
Yeah. I want one that speaks English.
I generally think that you get better customer service with women than you do men. I could be wrong, but it's like, great, there's some dude here. They're not patient, they're not very, maybe it's just me. Let me keep going. Biological traits: strong, heals quickly, high testosterone. Woman, perceptive, fights infection, low testosterone. Functional hierarchy. You can look at this Trinitarianly. Again, to me, this is the best way of demonstrating there's not less value in these functions, because you see Trinitarianly the Son is submissive to the Father, 1 Corinthians 11:3. The theological function, the man is the leader and the woman is the completer. In the family function, the man is the worker, the woman is the childbearer. In church function, the men primarily are teachers and evangelists. Women primarily encouragers and have the gift of mercy. Men, the secondary would be encouragement and mercy. For women, secondary, teaching and evangelism. And you could argue that a little bit, because you could walk into some departments here in our church, there's probably more women in working with the kids than there are men working with the kids. In marital need, men primarily need respect and women love. Ephesians 5:33. Husbands, love your wives, women respect your husbands. But then look at the effects of the fall. The men have a passive punishment in that they experience hardship in work. Women have a passive punishment that they'll experience pain in childbirth. And then the active sin tendency in men is to abuse authority and rule harshly. And then in women, the desire to rule over man and rebel against authority. But then when you look at the incomplete image of God, would be if God was just what you saw in the man, with none of the other traits that are primarily women. The same way, if it was just women, no men, we would have this incomplete view of who God is. And can you imagine a world where there weren't men or weren't women? Maybe some of you could. I don't know. But it would be, it would be preferred. So you can read through these last two slides. I'll just end with this
Chad?
one. Yes.
You ought to have John tell about.
Oh boy.
In the Matriarchal Society of the Navajos that he worked for, how long, 15 years? 17 years.
Yes.
Tell about leadership meetings and all of that in this Matriarchal Society and how it falls through.
Well, I have to go, what was called chapter meetings, which was like the local government. And I was working at a coal mine. Oh dear. This makes it even worse. It's going to chapter meetings, which is the local government. And I worked for a coal mine and I was the landman. So I was dealing with a lot of land problems and problems with the community around the mine. And because of the women there, these things would go on forever. I mean, like 2 o'clock in the morning.
Because the women are all in charge.
They're in charge and they just talk and talk and talk, and it
They
was,
never could.
and half the time they couldn't come to a decision, and all this at 2 o'clock in the morning, it would get tabled to the next monthly meeting.
Let's schedule another meeting.
So, you don't want
Interesting.
you don't want to live in that society.
No decisions were ever made. on
Decisions
anything.
weren't made. Huh, they were talked about, they were discussed.
Oh, in great, great detail, right?
I just heard a very interesting, do you know how the Native Americans see daylight savings? Have you ever heard this expression they have? They said that only white men would cut 3 feet off one end of a blanket, sew it onto the other end of a blanket, and think they have a longer blanket.
That's good.
That's good.
Well, that's everything. Thank you all so much for being part of this and for coming in these weeks, and I hope it was helpful. I love teaching. I love going through this. This is probably one of my absolute favorite things to do is to be able to teach this, and I can't do that if somebody doesn't show up to listen. So I'm very grateful for you all being here, and us getting to have some conversations. We'll start up soteriology. So in January, it'll probably be mid-January to late January, we'll do another 10-week class on salvation. And it's been, to me, it's one of the best in this series. Because if you've ever struggled with security of salvation, this is dying. If you've ever struggled with security, like, man, I might kind of know that I'm saved. If you've ever struggled with, we'll work our way through this whole predestination thing. I mean, that is a troubling, troubling doctrine. It was very hard for me to work through. What does this mean that we are predestined? Does that mean double predestination? Did God predestine some to heaven and some to hell? Is that what the Bible says? I don't think it does, but a lot of people would take that position. We'll work through some of those really tough doctrines about salvation. If you don't know, we brushed up against Calvinism and Arminianism a little bit in this class. We'll go into it more depth when we talk about it in soteriology. Why do we have a Presbyterian church on one hill and a Wesleyan church on one hill and a Baptist church down here in the valley, and then non-denominational churches out there in the wings? A lot of this has to do with how they believe we are saved. And why isn't everybody saved? That's one of the hardest questions to answer. Why do some people here believe, and why do some people here not believe? So we'll talk about that in soteriology. Yes, ma'am.
And I've had Dallas Seminary class on soteriology.
Yes.
And the greatest thing it did for me was show the sovereignty of God.
Yes. Yeah, God is absolutely.
God became much, much bigger and much greater
Oh, that's good.
and much more, I want to say, easily trusted with everything.
Amen.